Well, again, we get to engage in this thing. So if you guys are joining with us here or online, man, we're excited about just being able to unpack this content that's really begin to really define who we are and help us to move to where we need to be. And so, so for those of you who walked into this room, you have a little bit of this in a handout. And for those of you who are online, you can kind of follow the links to be able to find out what this looks like. Again, all of these things are linked into that document, so it is a rich amount of information that is there. But we want to just begin to take a little bit of time this afternoon and to be able to talk through this understanding that we have this rich opportunity as people who are working with college students to work with the most influential, top 2% most influential group of people in the world, future leaders of all different domains. And to be able to help trying to figure out what is it that we have in front of us. And when we think about the leadership potential in front of us on college campuses, what does it look like for us to move from point A to point B? And when we started this process, we began to recognize the leadership potential. And here's the way that we thought about this. I think if we can transition to this, it'd be great on the screens. Is it working? Have it yet? All right, so let me grab it. Let me make sure that it's linking together. Make sure that we're rolling in here. So, because I want to be able to talk through really the difference between what this looks like. Okay, here we go. So when we thought about this from the very beginning, one of the things that we really talked about, it was really seeing this idea from the lens of progression. Really, it kind of looked like this for us, that we're trying to get from this point to that point, all right? And so we began to identify all these things, all these kind of moments in there, and we really kind of built our leadership pipeline based upon this kind of linear progression through this thing. And what we began to realize is that's not actually how people progress. Like the way that people begin to grow as leaders is not linear in that context. That what it takes for them to get to this point is not just more of that to get them to this point, right? That for them to get to these things, it's not just adding things more of the same, but it's something else. And so for us, really what it looked like is beginning to, again, in the current thing that you have in front of you, to be able to look at this in this context. We got it? All right, perfect. But to be able to say that's not linear, but there's something that happens that radically changes. And for us to understand that going around these curves like this is really a significantly different experience than what it takes to get there. And so I want to walk through this with you guys and just begin to help you to understand why we made some of these things and what does it look like for you to help people in your ministry to progress. What we're talking about, just to be clear, is really this understanding of how do you go from 18 to 25, right? What does it look like to progress somebody in a rapid place to where they ultimately can begin new works, where they can begin to lead and be a spiritual authority in a context? And so how is it in this speedy of a timeline that you can actually have something that is not reckless and not ridiculous for us to be able to pursue? We're going to walk through some of that. So for us, really it begins with this idea of starting with the freshmen. And really specifically what we talk about is starting in the context of a non-believing, non-church background freshman. That's the primary target. When we begin to see someone who has that kind of the context that they're framed in, what it does is allows us, this is one of the key things, to start at that moment. Actually seems like it's slower than really starting with someone who comes from maybe a background of having a healthy youth group environment and comes that is like a ready-made disciple. But in the context of actually making a church planter, what we found is that it is really hit and miss sometimes whether or not somebody who's not a non-believing church or non-believing freshman can actually make the transition all the way to church planter in a significant way. And I can unpack that a little bit to be able to say that these progressions they begin to build within them a new DNA, a new context. And if you have to deconstruct that, sometimes it takes much longer to deconstruct something that has been placed in there that is of a different kind of ministry understanding. And so when you think about starting from scratch, oftentimes it starts slow, but sometimes you got to start slow to get to a fast place of multiplication. And so this is what we look for. And so it really begins with this idea of really this being this blank page when it comes to helping someone to find Christ and ultimately to move. What happens in that first phase is that they go from being a freshman. And again, you have these moments that they have, and what we've tried to say is, what are some of these most significant moments that really pushes them towards this next stage? But this next stage for us is this idea, we use the words engaged contributor, and maybe that sounds like kind of a duplicate term, but it's really key for us to say that they are engaged in this, that there's something about this that they are not passive in. That we're trying to get them into not being a consumer of something, but to be actively participating in that. And not only participating in that where it's highly engaging, but being able to own something that they contribute. That the idea of them having personal responsibility is a massive moment in the leadership pipeline of this. And so that they begin to own something in what it looks like. And so what we've done there is we've tried to say, what does it look like to have some of these breakthrough indicators? Like, how do you know if someone has arrived at this moment where like kind of they begin to move into this? And so what we say is that if there's this idea of personal transformation, this idea that they are not the same as they've been, that they can go back and say, hey, because of this group of people, because of this moment, because of this experience, I'm not the same. And if you have someone that has such a stark moment to be able to say, this is what I used to be, this is who I am now, I'm a new creation, what this does is that, again, it pushes you into the potential to get to these places more and more significantly. That people say, hey, this is not just the best church. This is my people. This is who told me about Jesus, and my heart is connected to them. This is not just a volitional choice that I've just said, hey, there's a buffet line, and I'm just going to choose this one. But these people helped me to find Christ. The love that was given to me, like I'm a part of this. I'm deeply integrated into this group of people. That personal transformation. If there's no personal transformation, then likely there's not going to be personal sacrifice. This is just the correlation together. And so if you don't help someone to have a personal transformation, it's unlikely that you'll be able to send them out in a sacrificial way that really movement demands. And so helping people to be able to say, what does it look like? And so maybe for all of us, you would say, hey, there's a place of personal transformation, and ultimately that put me into this room. The other part of that is we want to talk about what happens in a post-college trajectory. And so if you were to take this and just extend this line out and say, okay, they leave at this point, what are they? And we identify them as there's been a worldview change around the gospel. So they go from not having any kind of gospel worldview to following Christ. And so that following Christ happens somewhere along this context. And then they get to a point where they would become a convictional believer. This is kind of out of some language that Ed Stetzer developed. It basically says there's three classifications sociologically. So you have a cultural believer, a congregational believer, and a convictional believer. And so, cultural, this is a part of my family history, but that's really the only identifier. A congregational might be able to say, hey, I know where to go if Christmas and Easter, I know where to go to church, but it doesn't really affect the rest of my life. And then a convictional believer is saying, hey, this is something that's integrated into the rest of my worldview. And so if they find Christ, there's personal transformation, and then they graduate and go out, at least there's a worldview that's been formed there. But there's a moment, again, as they begin to round that curve and we begin to say, hey, personal transformation begins to happen. And then what begins to be available is this understanding of this next piece of this. And this is all from a guy named Ram Sharan that really kind of created this. And then and more specifically in the North American Mission Board world, a guy named Mac Lake has been really crucial in helping us form our thoughts around this. But really what they say is that this whole piece kind of starts here. And that's where leadership begins. And leadership begins for us, I just crossed it out, but this mobilized missionary. And really what happens here is this is what he has identified as saying, this is where you begin to have self-leadership. So before you can lead anyone else, you have to lead yourself. And the most key thing for us to be able to say that we identify a self-leader is when they begin to understand their viewpoint of themselves as being a missionary. And so they have been, so you look at that missional engagement, somebody has engaged them with the mission. Now they continue to go back all the way, it's kind of full circle, where they now become the people that are engaging others in the missionary, and that in the mission. And that's really helping us to be able to say, hey, now you're in a place where you have demonstrated self-leadership. And so that self-leadership piece is really crucial, because what you'll begin to see in there is this understanding of missional impulse. And what we mean by missional impulse is this, that the idea of extending the kingdom of God is not because of some sort of expectation that is external to them. Maybe that's a social expectation or a programmatic expectation of being able to do evangelism or create connections with non-Christians in your life. They begin to think about this naturally. So it's the difference between, when you learn a language, there's a difference between, they say, where you're still translating. So if English is your primary language and you're trying to talk another one, that there becomes a point where you dream in the next language, right? In the language that you're learning. And you begin to be fluent in that to a point where you begin to think thoughts in that new language. What we hope that they begin to do is they begin to dream missional dreams. They begin to be fluent in missional thought, that they begin to see themselves as an extension from the very beginning of Acts 1:8 towards the campus and towards the world. If they graduate and they continue to take that mindset, they go into places, again, for us in the Northwest, they begin to go to Boeing, and they begin to go to Amazon, and they begin to go to Microsoft, and a number of other places, and they carry with them this missional impulse, and they become marketplace missionaries. And so when we think about the bulk of people that come through our context, man, this is where we want them to be at least self-leaders, for them to be able to go out and say, hey, I'm going to take, and I'm going to know that I'm an employee of Boeing, but I'm actually on mission for Jesus. And that's a huge thing, to be able to think about what it looks like to have an army of people that get sent out from these college campuses into these places of influence. And so that's this massive piece to this. And so what happens is that's really the beginning of leadership. And it goes from leading yourself, and we begin to identify, hey, who are the people who are leading on mission? And they're the people that we begin to say, okay, those are the people that we begin to engage, and we begin to identify them, and we begin to bring them in and say, hey, if you're leading yourself, there's a potential that you have the capacity to lead others as well. And so what we see there is this transition into these experiences where they begin to lead, to have a small group leader training. Again, you can find that. If you click on that document in the vault, you'll go to all of our small group leader training, and we call them Joshua's, and really talking about what does it look like? And we have a pipeline to be able to help go from saying, hey, I'm just an attending person in this small group to I'm leading this. And so it'll be able to give you all of our material for that. By the way, this is a specific pipeline for us to get to church planters, but we have one of these. It's not as developed in terms of a document like this, but there's pipelines for everything that we do. We just think pipeline now. So how do we develop worship leaders? We have a pipeline to figure out how do you get someone from a guy who's interested, or we need leadership. Everywhere we need leadership, we need a pipeline to get them there. They don't just magically happen. It has to be intentional. So they go through these things, and again, you see those specific experiences that we've tried to distill down and say, hey, this is how we've seen people progress. And these are the shortcuts. These are the ways that we get there faster. So what happens here is this significant moment where this person decides to really step into this role of being a small group leader. And the key breakthrough indicator that allows them to round the turn is they begin to take leadership responsibility for not just themselves, but they take leadership responsibility for other people. So if we think about the difference between a disciple maker or a disciple and a disciple maker, and someone who begins to say, I'm going to take responsibility for the discipleship of the people around me. And that is a massive moment for them to be able to see themselves, again, not just as a disciple. I'm not just following Christ and it's just me and Jesus, but part of my foundational responsibility is that I'm helping other people to find Jesus, and I'm helping other people to learn how to make disciples. And so we talk about this third generation idea of helping become disciple makers. Because of a conference called Exponential and its theme, we've tried to use the word hero maker. So instead of being the hero, we're trying to be hero makers, and that's beginning to kind of latch on in terms of our nomenclature of what it looks like. So if they continue to kind of exit and graduate, what we hope that they become is someone who's not just a marketplace missionary, but they carry with them the capacity to start something new. That they could be a church plant team member. That they could leave with one of our church plants and go start another church on another college campus. Or maybe that God's calling them someplace else. And they've already learned how to start a group. They've already learned how to establish a community of faith on a college campus. And it's a really short step to be able to say, hey, now do that in your neighborhood. Now do that in your workplace. Now do that in your third place. Now use your hobby around that. But they've already done that. They've already had an experience around that. And so it's almost like house church planting or micro church planting that they would be able to take and extend that out after they graduate college. So if they round that and they begin to take leadership responsibility and they begin to do things, begin to invest in their leadership in these like a leadership cohort, and you can find out a little bit more. And then they begin to lead other people in these significant summer projects that we do. What happens is there's a progression ultimately for them to be a small group coach. Now, the massive difference in being a small group leader and a small group coach is that they have to learn a really significant leadership lesson, and that is this idea of empowering and equipping. And sometimes the people that are really good at being small group leaders are really bad at being small group coaches. But how you get people to progress into greater and greater levels of leadership is then they begin to realize, I can't just do this all myself. I can't just continue to be a doer. I have to empower others, and I have to help others to be successful. Again, to be the hero maker, if that's the theme that you begin to see happen, that they begin to be people who are really creating others' success. And I heard this, and I can't remember who says this, but they begin to realize that the fruit of their leadership grows on other people's trees. And so that's not my quote, so don't quote me on that, but an unknown quote, right? Anonymous. It's not anonymous, I just can't remember. But they begin to see themselves in that way, and that's that first moment of really an attack on our pride. So we begin to have this moment where, and it's all of our staff, I think it's been a success that's massively different. And I would say this, that there's a significant amount of paid ministers and staff that has still not understood this idea fully. That their role is primarily to be an empowerer and an equipper and not a doer of ministry. And so there's just a massive amount of fruit in that, doing ministry. And we want to rehire you to empower others to do ministry. And obviously that was more of a symbolic moment than a real, change in our staff. But it began to hint at this idea of one of the major shifts that we had. And so if they leave and they begin to graduate out of college and they go on with the context of being able to be a small group coach, what they end up being is someone who starts stuff, a ministry starter. Maybe that is a church planter, something like that. But you begin to see someone who can gather a group of people and they begin to empower them to do something. And it's not just based upon them. You still see this progress on, and we go through these next kind of phase where a small group coach kind of moves towards being what we would call a planter in training or a site pastor in training, comes Spitz. It's not the greatest name, but it is very accurate in terms of what they're required to do. But we go through this second level of leadership. They begin to lead these coaches. They begin to lead summer projects, and they begin to take people and expose them to these, what we call these church planting trips. And this is one of those moments as they begin to lead this, what they begin to do is their idea of their leadership begins to transition from the place that they were grown up, that they were given leadership, to be able to kind of sniff out what's that next place. And so as much as this next site scout trip is, and you'll figure out, if you get into that vault, you'll know what to do with that, how to go to a campus, what to ask, how to be able to see that campus. But that's really crucial for us because really what that does is it helps push them around this next understanding and this next part, this next framework change in a leader's mind is to be able to say, not just here, but there. And this is always really difficult because at this point, by the time that they're there, maybe they're 24, they're 23, they've had so much of, experience and community that's there. So to be able to change this, to be able to say, okay, how do you go from just seeing yourself and your identity in this place to seeing your identity and the focus on another place? And being able to think about the calling or the compulsion to leave is a significant shift to be able to say, hey, it's better for me to go. It's better for me to start something new. That while I would love to grow in my capacity here, to be able to go out of this is a really significant moment. And each of our site pastors really had to have a moment where they recognized that they could continue to be here, but actually that wouldn't be as good as going somewhere else and beginning to start over and beginning to have a new context for creating movement in the kingdom of God. So this is this place, and we again progress them towards this place of being a church planter. And so that's developing a team, that's really leading a campus strategy. And what we do is we take, and at this context, we place them into leadership over a site that we have. And so they are operating, typically it's the site that meets on campus, and they are on stage, they are creating the strategy behind that, they're leading the staff behind that, but it's in an established context. So what we want to do, we figure out really where we want them to make their mistakes is in front of us. If they can make their mistakes in front of us and we can have this context to be able to watch their leadership and watch them do what they do, then we can correct those things and we can be able to help them to be able to navigate the next steps. But we have eyes on them. And so one of the most significant things for our guys who are going to plant is their ability to receive redirection, their ability to be moldable. And we put them out there and we give them a lot of responsibility and we try to release that control piece so that we watch God work and help them to begin to understand who they are, how they're created, but we do that in the context where there's eyes on them. And so when we send them out, it's not with the hope that they do something that's really good, but it's beginning to say, hey, because we've seen these behaviors, we now have confidence that we can send you out. Again, what that takes is all of our site pastors stepping back. And that's a really hard thing when you say, hey, this is the church. I mean, I planted this church, and then 2 years later, you're in the back watching someone else on stage. And these guys, our site pastors, have been so incredible to watch them to be able to say, man, it's my joy to be able to put someone else in that position of leadership that's so exposed so that we might be able to see something happen in the third generation, so that we might be able to see something happen as it goes beyond just this one site. And so this is this progression. But I just want you to get, as you think about this, that all of this, that it starts with that freshman, and that idea of going from here all the way to a church planter. It's these shifts along the way. And if in your context, your pipeline may look really significantly different, that as you begin to look at what it takes, that you just can clearly understand what are the shifts in thinking that are going to be required as we begin to think about getting people from point A to point B, and just beginning to understand that it is just not a linear context to this. It's not something that just says more and more and more and more if you just spend time in this, but there's got to be a shift in thinking. There's got to be a shift from it's all about me, to personal transformation, to it's all about somebody else. That you begin to go from that mobilized missionary to a place of being able to say, I can lead myself, I can lead followers, I can lead leaders, I can lead coaches, and ultimately I can lead an organization. And that's the pathway that we want to try to figure out. How do we get from point A to point B? So in all of this, The goal is for you to be able to not necessarily replicate what we've done in this, but to be able to think in your context, what are you doing to get the people in your ministry in an intentional pathway to get to a place that is really creating impact on your campus and in your church and in your community? What are you doing? Have you begun to think through what are the processes, what are the transitions, what are the things that they need to grow in, and then trying to figure out how do you begin to reverse engineer and create specific catalytic experiences or whatever you want to call it that allows you to be able to get them into the next step of leadership. Again, every single thing that's in orange or in red on this, there's a place that you can go to online that begins to describe what we're trying to accomplish in this and how we do that, and then gives links if there's any more content. And so this is, our gift to you guys. It's taken us a while to be able to flesh all this through, and probably some of it's going to change, and we'd love feedback on this. But as we think about reaching the college campus, and we think about the ripe, just ready nature of college students who are learning to lead, our hope is that, again, not that you take this and replicate it in its exact form, but we all begin to think through how are we creating leaders that extend the gospel out into our campuses. So, Brian, I'm going to invite you back up to be able to kind of give us our next step and to be able to figure out what we do from this point forward. So